Hey, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. We had a strange kind of feedback issue that had not arisen on previous webinars. This is Kirsten from COVA. I'm so happy to be joined by Alicia Wagner and Carol Morris today. Thank you for signing up to watch the webinar. You should receive an email after the webinar, which is proof of your attendance. If you're planning to use this webinar for COVA certification or recertification, you will need to save that email and submit it with your packet. If you don't receive the email, I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat box now. If you are watching the archived version on YouTube, welcome, and we hope you find it informative. Please note that archived webinars may not be used toward COVA certification. Handouts are only available during the webinar. There are 2 handouts that you should have, and again, if you have any problem downloading those, I'll be happy to get those to you later. If you've got any questions during the webinar, you can type in the chat box or hit the raise hand function. I do have everyone muted. I think having the attendees unmuted might have been the source of our difficulty. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia Wagner.
Hey guys, I have included a pretty long PowerPoint here. I'm going to skip through some of the slides, but I wanted you to have them so you have the good information. But the goal of this, is just to let you know what we as federal victim assistance providers do, why we exist, and what we can do to help you. So I have been with FBI almost 13 years now, and in Colorado for 8. So as we go through this presentation is designed for Colorado specific. If you have questions about other things, just please ask them. So people always ask, why does the FBI have a victim assistance program? And I am trying to figure out how to advance this slide. Just enter. Okay. So there's federal legislation, just like there is local legislation on rights that victims have. And so we have had victim people in that bureau as early as the early 90s, but it was more of a collateral duty. So it wasn't anybody specifically trained to know how to provide direct services. It was more of a send out letters and brochures. So in 2001, shortly after 9/11, our director had been the director of the FBI for about 2 days at that time. And he realized, okay, we have this giant federal case with all these victims, and we don't have victim service providers. And that is kind of when our program started. So our program is ran through the Office of Victim Assistance at the FBI. It's now the Victim Services Division. We are funded by VOCA funds, just like many of you are. So we're FBI employees, but we're not. When people tell me they're taxpayers pay my salary, they're wrong, unless they're a criminal and have paid a fine. So that is where our funding comes from, is OVC. This is what the federal criminal justice system looks like. It's very similar to the locals, where we have an investigative law enforcement agency, we have the prosecution, and then we have the Bureau of Prisons. All of those entities have people who are responsible for victim assistance stuff. The other reason why we exist are the federal statutes, and here they are so that you can see them. We're also guided by the Attorney General Guidelines for Victim and Witness Assistance. The last ones came out in 2011, but they basically guide each federal law enforcement agency on the things that they should be doing with regards to victim assistance, and based on these 2 laws that you see listed here. If you want to look them up, you sure can. So it's our responsibility as the FBI, first of all, to identify victims. Sometimes people laugh and they're like, wait, victims don't know that they're a victim of crime? Well, when you talk about federal crimes, sometimes they don't. So, hold on, we're doing something. Okay. Sometimes they don't, because we have a bunch of computer intrusion cases, we have big identity theft cases, lots of financial fraud type cases that sometimes victims don't realize at the moment that it is a fraud. And so Our initial responsibility is to identify victims and let them know that they're a possible victim of a federal investigation. We are also responsible to provide reasonable protection, just like local law enforcement agencies are responsible. We also offer services, and it's our agents' jobs to make sure if someone is in danger that we do what we can to protect them in a reasonable way. We do service referrals, just like all of you, victim notification. We as victim service providers oftentimes return the property of victims that we have collected throughout the investigation. We also do a lot of work with employers or debt notification and case coordination with outside entities, which I'll get into just in a little bit. So who is a victim? For federal law enforcement investigations, this is our definition of a victim, and it comes from those laws that I talked about earlier. So we have primary victims, which could be the next of kin if it's a deceased victim, non-offending family members if we have minor victims. We also, our laws are a little bit different in that we don't just cover violent crimes regarding victims' rights, and so oftentimes we have businesses, corporations that are our only victim in a case. We also provide service to secondary victims, so people who might have been indirectly affected, they might not get notification, but we still would provide services if they needed something. Who we don't consider a victim is government entities. We have lots of cases where the government is the victim. There's nothing that we do as victim service providers with those cases. And then also culpable victims of the crime being investigated. So that confuses people sometimes, and the example I always give is like a human trafficking case. So if somebody was crossing the border illegally, that is a crime they're committing, and it's a crime against that border. But once they got to the United States, if they were then trafficked, they would be a trafficking victim. We would work with them as a victim because they're not guilty of that crime. They're guilty of a different crime, but that doesn't matter regarding our service provision to them as a victim of the human trafficking case. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's helpful.
We do a lot of specialized work with child victims, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking victims, and elderly and disabled victims. We have a victim notification system, just very similar to the VINE system. It's just designed for federal cases, and this talks about that. You can go back and look at that if you choose to. So this slide kind of delineates the difference between what an agent does and what a victim specialist does. Of course, we always work hand in hand with our agents who are investigating the case. But it's ultimately the agent's responsibility to identify who the victims are. Sometimes we work with them and suggest why somebody should be a victim or not a victim. But most of the times the agents are, here are your list of victims, and that tells me who I need to reach out to. And then once we get that list of victims, the first thing we do, like I said, is notify. And then we do some triaging, where we assess their needs, crisis intervention, just like you guys do, is what we do. Our roles actually look very similar, just working within a law enforcement agency. So I'm not going to go too much into that because most of you on here will know what direct services to victims look like. We continually communicate, obviously, with the agent to see if needs come up, or if we learn something investigatively from the victim that the agent doesn't know, we communicate that back to the agent, obviously. And so we do direct services, whether it's counseling referrals, whether it's housing, food, clothing, medical, all of that type of stuff.
And actually, Alicia, can I jump in and ask
Sure,
a question? This
sure.
is Kirsten. So we do have some folks on today who are from medical
Oh, okay.
as Human Services. So could you maybe address a little bit about whether you have confidentiality and how that might look different for you than for someone working in a safe house or a nonprofit?
Absolutely. So we are employees of a law enforcement agency, which means we do not have confidentiality to that victim. So if a victim tells us something that is case related, we have to tell our investigating agents. We don't have a choice to keep everything they say confidential. Because of that, I oftentimes refer our victims to local nonprofits who do have confidentiality so that they can process with that agency what issues they're struggling with, what they want to maybe tell law enforcement and what they don't, because, some of our cases are, like our human trafficking cases or child pornography cases, they involve really sensitive material. And so it's good for, I believe, it's my belief, that it's good for victims to have someone that they can talk to that is completely confidential. And then once if they share the same information with us, they can't say, oh, well, don't tell the agent. That's not possible for us to do. We both do. Carol will talk a little bit about her ginormous territory. I thought mine was big until I met her. But we have huge territories. So up until very recently, I covered 3/4 of the state. So I do a lot of coordination with local service providers, because if something happens in Alamosa or Durango or Colorado Springs, it's my responsibility, and I can't be at all places at once. So it's very important that we have those partnerships also.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So here's some of the stuff that might be a little bit different that we have versus some of the local programs. We have up in DC, where our headquarters is, we have a program that deals with the child pornography specifically. So anytime in any case, whether it's a local case or a federal case, where we have a suspect that is possessing child pornography, those images are submitted to NCMEC, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, to figure out if those victims have been identified. And then our program, the CPVA, they creates the list of, yes, these are the victims, this is the point of contact for these victims, and so whatever agency is able to have contact with those victims, or at least notify them that their images have been possessed somewhere else throughout the country. I fall under the Criminal Victim Assistance Program, but we do have, in DC, we have program managers that help us. I talked about the victim notification system. We have somebody who manages that, and then we also, thank goodness, have a large-scale case coordinator. So when I do have a case that has more than 200 victims, there's somebody who can help us enter them all into the notification system, help us send those letters out, help us manage that kind of caseload. There's often times where I have 3 or 4 cases at the same time that have more than 200 victims, and so that can be a big deal. And oftentimes these victims are all across the country too, and so to have somebody to help us coordinate that is definitely helpful. And the last thing we have is our terrorism and special jurisdiction program. So we have victim specialists at DC who are responsible for cases overseas where an American is injured or killed. So they work with the families of the deceased or the injured. If it's an injured person, they work in helping get them back home and get them services here in country. If it's deceased, they do the same thing, helping get the body back home, and then working with the family of the deceased. We also have our own forensic interviewers. We call them CAFIs, which is Child and Adolescent Forensic Interviewers. A lot of times people think that means all of their names are Kathy. And I've had agents say, hey, can you call Kathy? And I'm like, that's not her name. But we were the first program in the first federal law enforcement agency to have forensic interviewers within our agency. When I came on, we had 3 for the entire country, and then for a long time we had 4. We're now up to 13, which is very helpful. All they do is travel around the country and interview kids. We have 2 who are located here in Colorado, which also makes it a lot easier for us to be able to get interviews scheduled. But if there is a case where, like originating in Colorado, and say it was a kidnapping or a missing kid, and we found the child in Louisiana, we could very quickly get a very specialized forensic interviewer out to Louisiana who's based within a law enforcement agency to work to interview that kid. So it is a resource that we offer to local law enforcement agencies all the time. We do a ton of those types of cases. They also do a ton of training. And so if anybody in your jurisdiction who works with kids or talks to kids or interviews kids wants training from them, they do a great training on presenting evidence. We present a lot of evidence to kids in our interviews. And they do a training on how we do it and why we do it based on research-based practices. So, no questions yet?
Yeah, let's take a moment and see if anyone's got a question. Of those cases I have one actually, and that is, what % would you say of like the children who've been victimized through pornography or folks, are not aware that those images of them were out there?
It's a small percent.
Okay.
Of kids who are not aware. But we have had some cases where pictures were taken of them as infants and by a daycare provider or whatever, and so they find out years later, and we have to try to identify who those kids are, so they're not aware of that.
Okay.
We have some cases where the child is sleeping, where we still wonder if they actually know. But we have lots of cases where we have kids who have never disclosed, but we have images of those kids, so we know what happened. And so we go into an interview and we start talking to them, of course not in a leading way. Nobody ever says, hey, did somebody touch you? Like, that's not how we do an interview. But start asking questions and have kids who are like, nope, they're still not disclosing, but we have images. And so we then use those images in a safe way, in a research-based way, to show that the kids, well, do you know who this kid is? Can you identify this? So I've had really interesting cases where we even showed a kid, he was 11 at the time, I think, his images from when he was 6, 7, and 8. He's like, nope, that's not me. Like, left the interview completely, that's not me. And we always follow up with, well, if you want to talk to someone later, who would you talk to? He picked mom. As soon as they left, they got home, he then disclosed to mom and told mom everything. And so then we were able to re-interview him. And for him, it was, he finally got the chance to disclose in a safe way. And had we not used that evidence, that probably wouldn't have happened, and we probably wouldn't have been able to prosecute. So we have a bunch of those cases, lots of examples of that.
Cool. Looks like we might have a couple questions. Hang on a sec.
Sure.
So Janelle, thank you. Looks like you've got a hand raised. I'm a little afraid to unmute you due to the feedback that we had before. If someone's still has a question, if you want to we'll take a second here and you can go ahead and type the question in. And we'll work on that.
Should I continue as we're typing?
Yeah, good
Okay.
plan.
So currently, there are 154 victim specialists throughout the country. There may be more now. We get funding every year to add more positions based on the drug services we provide. So I'm not sure the exact number. It's hard to keep track. When I started in 2007, it was 112. So it's great to see that we're getting more and more people. 42 of us are specifically trained to work on Indian reservations. So the FBI has jurisdiction on some Indian reservations throughout the country. And so those victim specialists who do that, I technically am an Indian country victim specialist because there is Indian country in southwestern Colorado. But people always laugh because we now have 3 victim specialists in Colorado, but like North Dakota has 4. And they're like, why is there more in North Dakota, right? Well, it's more because it's Indian country, and that's all they work. And when we work in Indian country, we have jurisdiction over major crimes, which would be domestic violence, sexual assault, murder, normal assaults, all of that type of stuff, which we don't have jurisdiction if it's not on an Indian reservation. So those victims are working, or those victim specialists are working a lot more violent crimes, which is a lot more intensive, and that's why there's more of them in places where we have a high population of Indian country agents who are working that. To be qualified to be a victim specialist, you have to have at least a bachelor's degree and at least 3 years working with victims of violent crime. Many of us in the field have master's degrees. The degree needs to be in a helping field, so like social work, psychology, counseling, stuff like that. And then the practical experience. And then some of the positions require knowledge and expertise in other cultures, very specifically the Indian country positions. We do have a few that we need Spanish-speaking people also. People always say, oh, how do you get your job? Or how did you get your job? And I say, I applied. We always have positions open, always. They're just not always in places you want to live. So in Colorado, it will be hard to ever get a position because once one opens, we open it internally first, and there's always people who want to move to Colorado, as you know. But we have many positions open right now. So if you are willing to move somewhere else, I mean, just look, it's on USA Jobs and FBI Jobs for those positions. So we work in partnership with our agents. My favorite part of my job is I'm on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. People ask, how do you do that? We do it because we're not an agency of first response. So it's not like a local law enforcement agency that's responding to violent crimes all the time. Most of the time, in our cases, local law enforcement are called first. As you guys know, in Colorado, there are a bunch of victim advocates within those law enforcement agencies. And so we typically don't even respond till the next day, where we can coordinate with advocates who have already responded to that case. And then, like I said before, we interact a lot with other partners, whether it's medical, Department of Human Services, nonprofits, whatever that might look like.
Nice. Right.
So the FBI, I am part of the Denver division of the FBI. Our division is responsible for the District of Colorado and the districts of Wyoming. We have 10 what we call resident agencies, so like offices basically in Colorado and Wyoming. So Rita Gatlin and Terry Nave are the victim specialists up in Wyoming. There's 2. Why are there 2 in Wyoming? There's 2 in Wyoming. They're both in Lander because we have big Indian country cases up there. Andar is the victim specialist who's in the Denver field office. I cover the Colorado Springs office, our Pueblo office, our Durango office, and a couple of our squads, so any of our white collar cases or our cyber cases out of Denver. And then Jessica Jimenez just joined our agency. She came from Coeur d'Alene, so she's been a victim specialist for 9 years, but she just moved to Denver, and she covers Fort Collins, Grand Junction, and Glenwood Springs. these are the types of services that we provide. So for those of you that don't provide direct services, you can kind of see what we do. One of the things that we do that I think might be a little bit unique is we do a lot of intervention with employers or like debt collectors. And what I mean by that is we can send a letter that says, yes, this person has been a victim of a crime. Please please acknowledge that as you're working with them. We can't say, we are the FBI, you have to forgive their debt. Like, that's not something we can do. But oftentimes those letters are helpful because they're legitimate, and so they help the victims at least get a little bit of time or a little bit more leeway when working through some of those cases. Because in our Ponzi schemes or financial fraud type cases, some of our victims have lost all of their life savings, and so there's lots of financial stuff they're facing. We also work with employers, and when I say that, usually it's bank employers where we have lots of bank robberies. We can do some education with those employers and what it was like for their tellers to be part of that, and maybe they'll consider that when people aren't wanting to come back to work or somebody's having a harder time than someone else. And I find that to be pretty effective too. But again, it's ultimately the decision of employers or creditors what they're going to choose to do. Another thing that we do a lot is we have the ability to transport victims, where a lot of local agencies can't do that. We have vehicles that are bureau vehicles that we are able to transport. Very recently, I transported somebody from Denver to Durango, which is a long way. So here is my contact information. The main office for the FBI is also on the slide that you guys have in front of you. I'll just say it again just to make sure. It's 303-629-7171. If you hit 2, you'll get a real person. You can get a hold of any of the victim specialists by calling that. You can ask to speak to a victim specialist. You can ask for a specific one of us, and they'll transfer you to us. So if you have questions or needs, we do a lot of assisting and partnering on cases that aren't ours also. The one thing I really just want to address quickly, I don't want to take any Carol's time, our mass casualty cases, we do have a team of specially trained victim specialists who respond across the country to mass casualty cases. So I was a member of that team for 10 years and have stepped back a little bit recently, that have responded to cases like Las Vegas. I helped here in Aurora, the Lafayette movie theater shooting. But if something happens locally, you even though it's not an FBI case, you will oftentimes see us there just adding assistance and helping on cases where they overwhelm the local resources. And that's what the FBI does as a whole. We get involved in cases that have overwhelmed local resources and help when we can, even if we don't have a jurisdiction to investigate that case. So that is kind of why we exist and who we are. I love partnerships. And I say to everyone I talk to, you'll see on TV that when the FBI comes in, they always take over. That is not me, nor any of the victim specialists here. And that is not going to happen. If I'm on scene, that doesn't mean you have to leave. So, because I don't want to take on more. That isn't mine. So if you see us out there, we're just there to help, and hopefully we'll get to interact or meet a lot of you.
Any questions?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Alicia. Let's see if anyone has questions, and we'll just get reset to the next presentation. And yeah, all you have to do is pull yours up, Carol.
Okay.
We'll kind of watch and see if folks have questions.
There's no questions. It just means that I presented really well.
That's right. You covered
Perfect.
the four corners of the territory with perfection.
Yeah.
Okay, then we'll go ahead and roll into this and still take questions along the way.
We've got a tiny bit of time lag. Hang on one second. Let me make sure it rolls over. Hang on one second. We're going to stop and start again. Okay, go ahead. It'll catch up here in just a second.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Carol Morris, and I'm a Victim Assistance Specialist with Homeland Security Investigations, which is the criminal investigative arm of the Department of Homeland Security. And we'll roll into this. If you have questions along the way, still throw them out there. Just a quick overview. The Department of Homeland Security is a fairly young agency. We came into being after 9/11, and it was created by some legislation and act. And again, Homeland Security Investigations is part of that. We're the criminal investigative branch of that. What you see in front of you are the 7 departments of Homeland Security. Some you may be familiar with more than others. So Customs and Border Protection, those folks are known as CBP, and they work the border. Citizenship and Immigration Service, a lot of our NGOs are familiar with that because they help folks with their immigration and the path to get status. The Coast Guard, FEMA, are all part of Homeland Security, Secret Service, and TSA. And then ICE. We are actually under ICE, and so is ERO, which you see here. Now, ERO are the ones under ICE who do all the immigration stuff. And again, Homeland Security Investigations, we do criminal investigations of all sorts. And I will go ahead and mention here, since I'm here, that with our investigations and our victim cases, we do not ask people about their status. That's irrelevant to us. We know sometimes that might be a hindrance for people to come forward, but we basically don't care about status of people, kids, whoever in our investigations. If we have a trafficking case federally and someone doesn't have status, but they want status and maybe the benefits that come with it, we can apply for continued presence. And some of you may be familiar with that. So it gives people temporary, it's a designation for 2 years, and benefits like a work authorization, et cetera, come along with that. But just in a sort of a regular child exploitation case, for example, we don't, status is not part of our interaction with them. Okay, we're pretty global. We're kind of all over the place. We work in 51 countries. We've got a lot of international offices, and that's especially important for our child exploitation cases. So I have cases right now where the bad guy may be in Colorado or one of our other states, but then the kids are out of country or vice versa. So as you know, obviously with the internet, things are far-reaching. People can be anywhere, whether you're the bad guy or, the kids being affected. So our caseload isn't just made up of kids who are sitting right here. Homeland Security has 30 main offices, field offices across the U.S. The main one here is Denver, and then the Denver office covers Colorado, Montana, Utah, and Wyoming, and that's my area that I cover. We have agents who work with me who also have collateral victim assistance duties, and so if I can't be somewhere, they kind of kick in until I can, or, instead of. So that's a great resource that we have. Homeland Security Investigations covers all kinds of cases, like you see here, child exploitation, counterfeit things, human smuggling, human rights violations, drugs, gangs, sort of the usual stuff that a lot of local agencies cover. In terms of victim cases, my caseload is primarily made up of child exploitation, trafficking and financial crimes, identity theft, romance schemes, kind of fraud, different kinds of fraud, so those kinds of things. And those are the main ones that we do. And that's kind of a difference between us and the FBI, is that they have Indian country and we don't. And they also work mass casualty. So they do have some jurisdiction that we don't, and so we wouldn't be involved in those kinds of cases.
Interesting.
Our victim assistance program, even though the department's been around since 2002, our victim assistance program is much newer. It's just been around since 2009 in the national world. And so we are still adding people. Right now there are 30 of us, and then that's probably going to stay that way for a while. We all have different territories. Again, some of us are multi-state, and some of us just have big cities. Like we have somebody in New York, and she just covers New York. Or we have somebody in Phoenix, and he just does Phoenix. So it just kind of depends where we've got multitudes of cases. That area is split up. But in general, we're pretty lean and mean.
Yeah, just New York. That's kind of funny how you said that. There's only 10 million people there.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And again, like other federal victim assistance providers, we are, our backbone is based in federal legislation. And here are the ones Alicia mentioned too. So Crime Victims' Rights Act, laid out the rights victims have. So we are guided by the CDRA as opposed to Colorado local victim providers who theirs is VRA. The Rights and Restitution Act, and then the Attorney General Guidelines for Victim and Witness Assistance is sort of a translation of that legislation, kind of, lays out more concretely what you all have to do as federal providers. Okay, so like many of you, if you're local advocates, when we have victim cases, we enlist the people in our agency and others who make sense. We have a special agent who's assigned. Generally, they're what we call an SME, a subject matter expert. Myself, a victim assistance specialist. We have forensic interviewers, as Alicia mentioned, the FBI does too. So those folks, we went from having 6 to 30 just recently. Our forensic interviewers just interview kids and young adults, and they do that domestically and internationally 5 days a week. That's all they do. That's their piece to the case. Most of them don't even have plants because they're on the road 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year. That's their job. Computer forensic analysts, we call them CFAs in our office, have a role in all our victim cases, whether it's, chats, sexually abusive images, other things that, may be important for them to look at. One thing that HSI has is that we've got a HERO program. And so what that means is about 5 years ago, we started a program for wounded warriors who were coming back and needed a new career path. And what we did was offer them a career path in computer forensics, and we would send them to DC for a whole year, kind of to do an internship. It wasn't paid. Put them through a pretty serious and rigorous training program, and then if they wanted to after that, we would place them in an office at a full-time position. So we have probably 100 of those across the country. We have 3 or 4 in our Denver office, and they're very valuable. And they've now, what they do is look at this hard material all day long, but they're very valuable to us. And I added child advocacy centers. Obviously, as a law enforcement agency, we don't have our own, and some agencies do, but we don't have our own in-house interview place. We have places in our office where we can interview bad guys, but not kids or young adults. So CACs are very important to us. We use them in all our states. They welcome us, which is great, and I don't know if any of you are from CACs, but it's awesome that you have everything we need and we can walk in and even bring our own interviewer and we can use your space. So that's very important to us. I also listed DHS because we can't take custody of kids, and we call them the other DHS affectionately. So if any of you are with DHS, we talk about you in a very positive way because, again, you do things that we can't, but especially for a lot of our CE cases, that's very important. Okay, and again, this lists a lot of the things that I do in my everyday life, and this is just a sheet. Maybe if you're a law enforcement advocate, you work with officers who get it and they understand the minute you introduce yourself to them what they do, but that's not the case for me. With special agents and federal prosecutors that we work with, they often need reminded. So I developed this sheet that I change fairly often depending on what's going on to say, hey, here's what I can do for you, here's what I can't do for you. So it lists a lot of the things, and I often just use that too as a reminder. Use me for this. Remember I can do this. Remember I can't do certain things. I can't arrest people. I can't pick up your dry cleaning. But there are other things I can do for you that are helpful. And remember, to use me whenever. So, and most of them do, but sometimes you have somebody who works drugs or things, but they just happen to catch maybe a trafficking case or something, and they're not familiar with that. So it's a good reminder to remind them what we do. And
that's brilliant. If they gave victim advocates the power to arrest people, that's actually sounding kind of great to me right now.
Right. Yeah. All right. Okay, so this is just the brochure for the program Alicia was talking about. So one of the rights federal victims have is to be notified of case events from the minute they're identified as a victim in a case, and then from that point forward. So this is a brochure for that. People can sign up, and we enter them into this once we identify them in an investigation. They can get notice by email, hard copy, phone, whatever. And then we keep them abreast of what's going on past that, because for our cases, a case may go forward locally, it may go forward federally, or not at all. And so once there's an arrest, we can tell them that if there is, and if not, if a case is charged federally, then the U.S. Attorney's Office picks up with the notification after that. I think that's all about that. But again, as Alicia said, it's similar to Vine. And it gives them everything they need, and they can opt out if they want, if they're tired of getting paper, because they get notice of everything that's going on in court. So it may be 10 changes before you get to trial, and they can they can choose not to get all that paper if they want. This again is something that Alicia mentioned, the CPVA program, because we both deal with cases where images are taken of kids, and often they're out there. And so this program, and again, I think it overlaps with a lot of local advocates where you see images that once they're traded now 5 or more times, seen in law enforcement investigations, that they're given a series name. For example, Blue Pillow. It's just something that has something to do with an image that might be a name. And then because kids' names are not attached with those images, they're given a hash value. But once those images are identified and we know who those kids are, then they have a right to know that those are being out there if they want, and they can say, yes, I want to know, or no, I don't want to know. And when that child turns 18, then that right goes from the parent to the child, and kids have to be recontacted when they're 18. And sometimes that's challenging because you end up with a kid, as Alicia mentioned, maybe their images were taken very, very young, and maybe the parent didn't tell them or had that conversation with them, and suddenly they turn 18 and they have this right to have their own choice. And you might be the one to go out and have that conversation with them, to tell them there are images out there, sexually explicit ones from whatever time period in their life.
Can I jump in for 1 second?
Sure.
So that's another thing that, as victim specialists, we do a lot is even though it's not a federal case, the child pornography production case may have never been a federal case. Because of this program, we have to go out to these families, and like she said, when the child turns 18, although we have never been involved in the case before, but they happen to live in Colorado, it's our job to then explain that to them and see what they want done. And so oftentimes when we do that in partnership with the local agency that has been working with them. So it's not just like this cold call. So we would most likely reach out to our partners when something like that happens too.
Yeah. And that reminds me of something else I wanted to mention. When we talk about identifying victims, especially in cyber cases where there's been online sexual exploitation, a lot of those folks don't know really that they've been a victim until we contact them. And that's different than sort of a regular child exploitation case, regular meaning like a local case where you have a child who's been offended and they make a disclosure, and then boom, that sets everything in motion, and you have the CAC set up and everyone comes. A lot of times in our cases, what's more normal is that we have someone in a case, a child who maybe makes a disclosure or tells someone that they had images taken of them, and then we make an arrest of a bad guy. And when I say bad guy, that's whoever, not just male. And then when we go through all his or her forensics, and we see all these images of different kids, and we go through and identify those kids, and they may or may not have known those images were taken. So then we have to identify them officially, and we go and reach out to kids, for example, in our 4 states, and we basically knock on their door and say, hey, we're from Homeland Security, we are in the cyber division, we'd like to talk to you. And so we don't tell them very much, but parents show up at the CAC, and then we sit down with them and have their child interviewed, and for the first time they're finding out that they were a victim. Excuse me. So our cases in sexual abuse are a little bit different, but for child production cases where we've got someone who produced child pornography, in most cases that child was molested prior to or during. So we may be doing a joint case with your agency, where the molest or offense was taken locally, and then we prosecute, or the U.S. Attorney's Office prosecutes the production of child pornography. So we have joint cases sometimes that way, or sometimes it's just, both prosecutor offices talk and decide where it makes sense to take it, maybe for the most time, or where the kid wouldn't have to testify. So there's a balance there that gets part of the equation.
Would you say in your cases, a lot of those victims that don't know that they're victims are actually children who have self-produced their images and maybe sent it to who they thought was a boyfriend, who turned out to be a 60-year-old man, bad guy, and so they didn't realize, they knew they they knew there were naked pictures of them that were taken, but they thought they were done in a safe way, and they didn't realize that they had been spread.
Sure, because they trust. If
Right.
they give them to someone they know or think is a person their own age, then they just assume that, yeah, that's safe, or that they didn't spread further than that. And yeah, we have a lot of people who misrepresent themselves online, whether it's as a Facebook friend, Instagram, Snapchat, or whatever, and then, you know, it can elevate through sextortion, which you guys have probably heard of, and so there's a lot of threatening and whatever that goes on, and, you know, kids can be pushed kind of to the brink of, you know, suicide, which is pretty scary, but, and that takes some understanding and education with parents and others, because ultimately a lot of these kids who are offended on that way have never met this person, but you can still be, you know, harmed seriously and psychologically by that. So, yeah, we see these are the bulk of our cases. Okay, and something unique to Homeland Security, a couple years ago, the President put into effect the Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement Office, and this basically was deemed that cases that are local but have an immigration nexus should have a place to go. So there is now a voice office where people can access if they're involved in a case with immigration ties and find out more about that. And then the other piece of that program is what you see on the banner at the bottom. It's DHS Fine. And so DHS Fine kicks in when someone goes into ICE custody. So if you're already, you have a local victim or you're an advocate who's already in fine for a local case, you can, DHS Fine connects seamlessly to that. So then when that person, if and when that person goes into ICE custody, maybe after that prosecution or, you know, after the arrest, for whatever reason, skips that prosecution, then you should be able to figure out, you can register and find out where he or she is and when they're going to be released. If anybody has any issues with that, it's still a new program. It's working pretty well, but you can always call me and we can figure it out. An advocate can register as well to find out on behalf of the victim if they want to be notified. The other thing, too, I should mention is that when I had this slide where our sisters and brothers at ERO who do all the immigration work, there's actually a deportation officer in Denver who has victim witness collateral duties. So if you're with, especially like a local DA's office, who has someone who you're wondering about, the victim's wondering about, like after we released him from DOC, did he get picked up in ICE custody? We thought there was a retainer or whatever, or a detainer. You can let me know. And I talk with that. I serve mostly as a middleman with that deportation officer, and they will let you know through me, you know, if that person's in custody, and we'll share with you whatever we can. And sometimes local DAs need to know that, A, for victim safety, and also for any other hearings that might come up. And if DAs need to do a writ or whatever to get that person back. However, sometimes people in immigration custody are victims, and they're not always bad guys. So there's a reason to access that information as well. But anyway, this just kind of tells you how you can access that information, and it's still fairly new.
Cool.
Okay. And this is something unique to the federal system I wanted to mention. So when people are sentenced in the federal system, this is a sample of that sentencing paperwork that they get. Generally, it's 6 or more pages. We call them J&Cs, but you'll see on the upper right, it's called a judgment in a criminal case. So everyone has a paper that looks like this that comes out. This happened to be someone who was convicted of production of child pornography a couple of years ago. And what I did, where you see the green line, is I went ahead and sort of fast-forwarded to the last page where it talked about penalties. And there was the pages before told how much time and whatever he got. But I think what's unique, and a lot of people don't know, to our world and FBI's world, is that when people are convicted of a federal offense, a federal felony, they are given a special assessment to pay, and you'll see the $100 here. So he was convicted of one felony count of production of child pornography, so he has to pay $100. That goes into the Crime Victims Fund at OBC. Now, the connection of us to you is that that money goes into a big fat fund at OBC and then is redoled out to local programs, maybe your salary, maybe if you're a nonprofit, goes to you guys. So that's an immediate and something that goes to every federal felon, no matter what. And as you see the other fines that can be laid out here, if he had been ordered to pay restitution or a fine, that assessment is paid first. So I just think that's interesting. And again, like FBI, that goes back to pay their salaries. For us at Homeland Security pays it. We're not under OBC at this point in time. But anyway, just wanted to mention that because it's a tie of from federal to you guys, and that's money too that kicks into crime victim comp. So a lot of people think we have different resources financially than local advocates, and in fact, they're exactly the same. And for that reason, because a lot of resources out there are funded federally, and so they're open to federal or local victims. So I just want to mention that. Do you want to say anything?
That's correct.
Okay. Another resource that is unique to us is Operation Predator. And so if you're interested in knowing who is on our wanted list or what's happened to people we've arrested, this is a free app off iTunes or the Apple Store. And it just, it lists all the guys we're looking for. And you can actually file, if you've got information, you can access our tip line through there too. Okay. So you've heard from, and you're hearing from Alicia and I today, but you may or may not be aware that lots of federal entities have victim witness assistance, and some of them have full-time people, some of them have full-time folks who have big territories, and some of them have part-time people, and it just kind of depends. So we wanted to go ahead and list sort of this alphabet soup to let you know what other agencies actually offer victim assistance. ATF, BIA, I don't know if you guys know these or not, Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Prisons, which is our DOC. You can actually go there and there's an inmate locator online that anyone can look at to see if somebody's in federal custody. Sometimes people want to know when local guys are sentenced, if they're already serving federal time when they get out, and that's all public and online. DEA actually has victim folks, of course, the next two. The Internal Revenue Service. I don't know that they have actual coordinators. I know when you call their office, they actually have brochures when people have had their taxes defrauded or interrupted. NPS, the National Park Service, believe it or not, and think about that, all the Park Service in the country, when things happen on their land, they have jurisdiction. Social Security Administration, the USAO's, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Federal Prosecutor, certainly here in Colorado. They have offices in Durango and in Denver, and they have full-time coordinators. And then Postal Service, because they do child pornography, they do white-collar stuff, so they have a lot of victim cases as well. Do you want to add anything to that part?
The only thing is, so they might change frequently, or they might be like ATF might not be in Colorado, they're somewhere else, they cover Colorado. If you ever want to get connected to any of those, you can reach out to us so we can figure out who that is for you, or you could go to their website and I bet you can find it there.
Yep. And just as an example, and I think we have a colleague or two online from ATF, so we took some of their slides to show you too that they're set up similarly to us and in you guys if you're a local advocate in many ways. So there's a program manager. If you look at this slide, you can see how they're set up, and they have bigger areas than, for example, even HSI does. And they have regional victim witness specialists, and then they have one who does training. So anyone who has more than one person on their staff, I'm quite jealous of. But just again to show you, and if you would say, what in the heck would ATF do? They do guns, right? So look at all, if you look at the list of things that guns can be involved in and have victim crimes, then it's pretty eye-opening about the things that they could be involved in that you may not have thought about. And some of these, again, may overlap with local cases. But again, a lot of times they weigh in the federal piece to see if that's a way to, be a bigger hammer in terms of time or another way for the defendant.
So can I ask a question? And we're just having some delay with the slides here, so I won't ask you to go back 2 slides. But when you talked about the Postal Inspection Service, I guess I'm under the assumption that nobody physically mails child pornography anymore. It's all online. Tell me how the Postal Inspection, how does the post office get involved in these kinds of things?
Yeah. Well, sometimes they still do. In the old days, child pornography used to be brown, packages from out of country or whatever, and that's how they would do it. But really, when things are just even online, and cross boundaries, that can be, or things are, you've got solicitations for white-collar crime that still come through the mail that are false or fraudulent. They can do that. So, yeah, there's still lots of ways they can be involved and use the U.S. mail. They have a lot of jurisdiction that overlaps some of ours as well. So,
interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And then, again, what an ATF victim witness assistance person does, it's going to mimic what Alicia and I do, and maybe what you do as well if you're a local advocate, direct victim services to the cases on the slide before. Give them resources and referrals, keep them updated about cases. They might have to do, because of the seriousness of some of those crimes, provide death notifications, and also notifications in cold cases. So, just kind of to let you know, there's a broad scope of things that federal victim witness people might do that you may not have thought about. And they may have, some connection to a case that you're working as well, and that you can easily access them. And here's the list too. You guys will have this. If you have, a question of someone, hey, I wonder if ATF is involved in this or whatever, or you wanted them to do some training, here's all their contact information. So that's just another example of another agency that's out there doing victim work as well. And I think we're getting ready to wrap up, but I think one thing we want you guys to know is that there's no mystery to federal victim assistance. We do a lot of the same work. I think one of the main things that is different is that our geographic boundaries are different. If you're a local victim advocate, you probably don't have a bad guy out of the country, but you might. Or same with the victims that you're dealing with. They're not going to be in another state. They're going to be in your own jurisdiction. There are benefits to that, less driving, less flying. But again, a lot of the things are the same. We are going to access victim comp just like you are. We're going to access NGOs. Counseling services the same. We don't have any of that as our own. We're going to use CACs for the most part. We may even use your interviewers. If we have a case where one of our forensic interviewers isn't available, or there's a time issue, then we use local interviewers regularly, actually. So a lot of that is something that's going to overlap with something you're doing anyway. But I know we welcome working with locals as well, because we need you guys. A lot of you, you outnumber us, and a lot of times you're on the ground before we are, or there just may be a nexus that we get called into something. But again, like Leisha, we're not there to take over. It's just maybe, hey, here's the federal piece. Does Mom know about this, the Federal Victim Witness Notification Program, or whatever it is. Or maybe the person's in federal custody to begin with, but he's going to come back for local charges. Or maybe, again, there's an immigration situation that we can help, navigate or sort out or get you a connection for. So I think that's about all I have. If anybody's got questions, show them and we'll get to them.
I just want to add one more thing. Something else that we can offer, and I think that we're good at, because we have victim specialists or victim assistance specialists across the country. If for some reason you have a victim that's not in your territory and say you need to do a death notification or something like that, that is something that we do all the time, where we get calls and say, hey, Alicia, the next of kin is in Alabama. Can you send out your victim specialist to go out and do a death notification so it can be done in person? Or you have a victim in Florida and you want resources, I can contact that victim specialist and get the appropriate resources for you. So that's something that we're always willing to also help with.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah, I know we've had a little bit of slowdown, just a little bit of slow internet here today. I apologize for the little time lag in slides. So we'll leave it up for a moment for anyone to ask some questions. And because I know we did have a little bit of audio difficulty at the beginning, I just want to mention that I do put all of our webinars on COVA's YouTube channel within the following week. It's COVA 789 is our YouTube handle, if you will. So if anybody missed a section or wants to catch back up, just know that that will be available to you. And I want to thank Alicia and Carol so much for joining us. It doesn't look at the moment like anyone's got questions. So yeah, you guys answered everything.
Thanks.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Have a good, hang on. I figured there'd be one. Oh, it's just that thanks so much. This information was great. Everyone have a great afternoon. Enjoy a late lunch, and we'll catch you the next time.